Hey there, Scott here with Saws on Skates. Today I'm going to show you how to make this folding miter saw station that I'm calling the MiterBot. It's unique because of these robot-like arms that fold to save space in a small workshop. It has a stop for repetitive cuts, and the stop can be stored out of the way when it's not in use. And since this is Saws on Skates, it's on wheels to make it mobile. I ran into a few design challenges with this build. The first set of arms didn't fold properly. I made a few tweaks and got the build back on track. In a few of the scenes you may see some of the original parts, but I've included all of the correct measurements in the printed plan. I started by making the sides. I cut 4 pieces of 1x4 for the vertical pieces, or stiles. I planned to paint the base of the MiterBot, so I used primed wood for these parts. I cut 6 pieces of 1x4 for the horizontal pieces, or rails. 4 of these pieces will be used for the sides, and 2 pieces will be used a little later for the bottom. I used my pocket hole jig to drill pocket holes in the ends of each rail. With all the pieces cut, I was ready to assemble the sides. I wanted the MiterBot to have a finished look, so I filled all of the pocket holes with pocket hole plugs. When the glue was dry, I used a small block plane to trim the plugs flush. Next, I started to work on the bottom. I cut a total of 6 pieces of 1x4. 2 of these pieces will be used to make the bottom, and 4 pieces will be used a little later to attach the sides. Again, I used my pocket hole jig to drill pocket holes in the ends of each rail. With all the pieces cut, I assembled the bottom. Next, I assembled the base of the MiterBot. Off camera, I used my orbital sander to smooth the joints. I drew a line on each side that was 3/8 inches away from the bottom, and I laid out the locations for 3 screws. I used a scratch awl to make a hole as a starting point for the countersink drill bit. 1 1/4 inch wood screws were used to attach the sides to the bottom. I placed the lower rails on the bottom, clamped them in position, and attached with pocket screws. I flipped the base on its side and attached the bottom to the sides with some more pocket screws. I set my multi-mark to 3/8 inches and drew a line on the bottom to lay out the locations for 3 screws. 1 1/4 inch wood screws were used to attach the bottom to the rail. Screws were attached on the second side, just like the first side. I moved the base to the floor so I could attach the 2 upper rails. Next, I cut 4 pieces of 1x4 to make the top supports. I used my multi-mark to measure in 1 inch at the top and bottom of each support. I connected these marks with a crosscut jig and used a circular saw to cut an angle. Then I laid out the locations for some pocket holes. To attach the supports, I first marked the location for a screw in the base. Pocket screws were used to attach the support from the outside. Next, I started to work on the wings. I cut 4 short pieces of 1x4 and drilled pocket holes in each end. I also cut 4 long pieces of 1x4. The wings were assembled just like the sides and bottom. I wanted the MiterBot to look like a store-bought piece of workshop furniture, so I sprayed it with 2 coats of gray paint. When the paint was dry, I cut a piece of 3/4 inch plywood for the top and centered it on the base. I clamped the top to the base and attached it using the pocket holes in the top supports. Then I marked the locations for screws to attach the top to the upper rail of the base. Next, I started to work on the arm anchors. I cut 8 pieces of 1x4 and marked the locations to drill holes that will connect the anchors to the arms. Then I measured in 1 inch on 2 of the corners. I used a compass on these marks. I'll use these lines to round off the corners a little later. I used my pocket hole jig to drill pocket holes in one end of the anchors. I chucked a 3/4 inch Forstner bit in my drill press and made a 3/8 inch deep hole in each piece. This will make a recessed area for the nuts and bolts. I also could have made these holes with a handheld drill. Then I chucked a 1/4 inch Forstner bit in the drill press and drilled a hole all the way through. Next I rounded the corners with my disc sander. If I didn't have a disc sander, I could have first knocked off the corners with a miter saw and then used an orbital sander to round off the corners. I used a sanding block to finish smoothing the corners. To give the anchors a finished look, I used a piece of sandpaper to smooth the edges of the holes and slightly round the outside edges of the piece. Next I started to work on the arms. First I cut 4 pieces of 1x3 for the lower arms. I used my multi-mark to lay out the locations of the holes that will connect the arms to the anchors. Then I measured in a 1/2 inch on each of the corners. I'll use these marks to round the corners just like I did for the anchors. I goofed when I laid out the holes in the arms. The recessed holes need to be drilled in the opposite ends of the arms. I used painter's tape to show me where not to drill. I chucked a 3/4 inch Forstner bit in my drill press and made a 3/8 inch deep hole in the opposite end of each arm. Then I chucked a 1/4 inch Forstner bit in the drill press and drilled a hole all the way through. Again, I used the disc sander to round the corners of the arms. I smoothed the arms with an orbital sander. Then I finished sanding the arms with a piece of sandpaper, just like I did with the anchors. Next I cut some pieces of 1x3 to make the upper arms. I marked the locations for the holes that will attach the arms to the anchors. I chucked a 1/4 inch Forstner bit in my drill press and drilled holes all the way through the pieces. After the holes were drilled, I attached the small pieces to the arms. I used a spare bolt to align the holes. When the glue was dry, I rounded the corners and sanded them just like I did for the anchors and lower arms. I cut 4 pieces of 1x2 that will be used to lock the arms. The locks will be held in place with screws. First I drilled countersink holes and then drilled a 1/4 inch hole so the lock will spin freely on the screw. I'll install the locks a little later, but I'll mark their locations on the upper arms now. Next I assembled the arms. I attached the lower arms to an upper arm with a bolt, some washers, and a nut. Two anchors were attached to each side of the upper arm. One anchor was attached to the outside of each lower arm. The stops were attached with 1.5 inch wood screws. I had to make new anchors in order to get the arms to fold properly. I filled the old anchor holes with glue and toothpicks. I positioned an arm assembly on the base. I want to be sure the arms will move freely, so I used a few playing cards as spacers. The arm assembly was centered on the side and clamped in place. I used a few pocket screws to attach the anchors to the base. I temporarily removed the arms. I need to flip the base over, and this will prevent the arms from flopping around. I flipped the base upside down and attached the casters. With the base still upside down, I centered one of the wings on the top. The wing was attached to the top with a 12-inch piano hinge. I reattached the arm to the lower anchors. The upper anchor was centered on the wing and clamped in place. A few pocket screws were used to attach the anchor to the wing. I added a piece of 1x2 to the back of each upper anchor. This will help push the arm upright when the wing is closed. I centered the miter saw on the top of the miter bot. I used a table saw to rip 2 pieces of 3/4 inch plywood for the tops of the wing tables. I could have also used my circular saw and my Kreg grip cut to make these cuts. I attached 2 pieces of 1x6 to the plywood. The 1x6s set in 1/4 inch from the edge and were attached with 1 1/4 inch wood screws. The wing tables extend over the top of the base, and I wanted to provide some support to these pieces. I cut 2 pieces of 1x2 for each wing table and attached them with 1 1/4 inch wood screws. The wing tables fit inside the wing and can be adjusted to match the height of just about any miter saw. I placed a straight edge on the miter saw table and adjusted the wing table until it was flush with the miter saw. I clamped the wing table in place and attached it with 1 1/2 inch lag screws. The miter saw was attached to the top with 1 1/2 inch bolts. I used a hacksaw to cut 2 pieces of T-track. The T-track was attached to the back of the wing tables and will be used to lock the stop in place. The back of the stop is just a piece of 1x3 with a hole drilled in the center. The stop itself is a 1x2 with 2 pocket holes drilled in one end. I sanded a bevel on each edge of the stop. This will prevent sawdust from building up in front of the stop. Well, that's it. The miter bot is ready to start making some sawdust.